Snow fell like ash from a sky emptied of color. It softened the pines, buried the fences, erased every path that might have led to Evelyn Hayes's cabin. The world outside was still and merciless, the kind of cold that silenced everything: birds, hearts, hope. Inside, the fire burned low, its small orange light pulsing against the walls of her solitude. She sat near it with her shawl drawn close, mending a tear in the hem of her wool skirt. The needle trembled slightly in her hand, not from cold, but from the familiar quiet that had begun to feel like punishment. The kettle hissed on the iron stove. Outside, the wind moved like something alive, moaning through the cracks, searching for warmth to steal. Evelyn had learned to ignore the sounds. Wolves, wind, the occasional groan of snow sliding from the roof. Loneliness had its own language, and she understood every syllable. Her golden hair, once braided with pride, now hung loosely over her shoulders. The color caught the firelight like a memory of summer. Sometimes she forgot what her voice sounded like. When she spoke, it startled her. Years had passed since the gossip had driven her from town. The whispers that she'd invited ruin, that she'd shamed herself, that she was too proud to beg forgiveness. In truth, she'd been left behind by a man who promised her the world and rode off before the wedding. The shame wasn't hers, but shame has a way of finding those who stay still long enough to receive it. She had stayed. She had learned the rhythm of silence. Wake, stoke fire, chop wood, pray for spring. A branch cracked outside. Then another. Her fingers froze on the hem. It wasn't the rhythm of wind. It was heavier, deliberate. She turned toward the door, heart thudding. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by something she hadn't heard in years, a knock. 3 times, slow and uncertain. Her breath clouded before her. She rose, every instinct pulling her back, yet some deeper current pushed her forward. She opened the latch. The door swung open to a wall of white. For a moment, she thought she was staring into the storm itself, until the shape moved. A man stood there, broad as the doorway, snow crusted on his dark hair and shoulders. His chest was bare beneath a tattered buffalo cloak, his skin scarred and bronze from a life she could not imagine. Behind him clung 3 small figures, children. One asleep in his arms, another clinging to his leg, and a third peeking from under the folds of his cloak. He didn't speak at first. His breath came in fogged bursts, the weight of travel heavy in his stance. Then, in a voice roughened by the wind and broken English, he said, "No fire. Please. Just one night." Evelyn stared, struck silent not by fear but by the sheer strangeness of it. A man like a mountain, an Apache by the look of him, asking mercy at her door with children in the snow. The wind clawed through the gap, chilling her to the bone. She should have shut the door. The world outside would say she should. But the sight of the smallest child, barefoot, cheeks red with frostbite, undid her completely. "Come in," she whispered and stepped aside. They entered like ghosts crossing into warmth. The children's small feet left watery prints on the wood floor. The eldest boy, 5, maybe 6, stared at her with wide, alert eyes, clutching a wooden carving. The youngest whimpered softly. Evelyn knelt, spreading the wool blanket from her cot around them, then rushed to the stove to stir the kettle. Her hands shook as she poured water over the last handful of dried herbs she owned. The man lowered the sleeping child near the hearth, his movements careful, reverent. Up close, she saw how exhaustion carved his face, the lines etched deep from sun and grief. He removed the cloak and draped it to dry, revealing a chest crosshatched with scars, a living map of survival. His gaze met hers briefly, and something passed between them, a wordless acknowledgement of loneliness recognized in another. She placed the steaming cup before him. "Drink," she said. He nodded once, murmured something in his language that sounded like thanks, and sipped slowly. The children pressed closer to the fire, small shadows flickering in the light. Evelyn found herself studying them. The way the eldest guarded the others, the way the smallest reached a timid hand toward the rising warmth. She asked softly, "Where are you headed?" The man hesitated. "Snow took home," he said finally. His accent thickened the words, but she understood enough. "We walk long time." She nodded. "You can rest here till morning." He inclined his head, a gesture of quiet respect. Then he sat cross-legged by the fire, the glow painting his skin in shades of amber and gold. His children soon fell asleep against him, their tiny breaths sinking with the slow rise and fall of his chest. Evelyn sat opposite them, the space between filled with the crackle of burning wood. She realized how strange it felt, to share her cabin, her air, her silence. The loneliness that had been her armor now felt like a wall too high. She wanted to ask his name, but something about the solemn way he watched the flames made her hold her tongue. The night deepened. Wind pressed against the windows, and snow hissed across the roof. Evelyn added another log to the fire, careful not to disturb the sleepers. She studied the man's profile. The straight nose, the strong jaw, the faint scar along his cheek. He was beautiful in the way mountains are, silent, unmoving, shaped by storms. She wrapped herself in her shawl and leaned back, letting the warmth ease her weariness. Her thoughts wandered. How long had it been since anyone had looked at her without judgment? Since any voice but her own had filled this room? A lifetime, it seemed. Her eyes drifted toward the smallest child. The girl's hand had slipped free of the blanket, fingers curled against the floorboards. Evelyn reached out gently, covering them with a fold of wool. The child stirred but did not wake. The man stirred too, his eyes opening. For a moment, their gazes locked. He didn't speak, but his expression carried gratitude so raw it unsettled her. She looked away, cheeks warm despite the cold. When she dared glance back, he was still watching her, not with suspicion or desire, but with the quiet awareness of one soul recognizing another's solitude. She turned to the window, needing air. Outside, the world was white and endless, the snow falling without pause. A low sound rolled from the distance, a mournful note that might have been wind, or might have been something alive. Evelyn shivered. The man seemed to listen too, his head tilting slightly. "Wolves," he said softly. Her pulse quickened. "They come close." He nodded once. "If storm keeps, yes." She glanced toward her rifle hanging by the door, but he was already rising, moving with the effortless strength of someone who had fought for every dawn. He reached for his cloak and opened the door a crack. The snow swirled in, catching in his hair like stars. "I will stay," he said. She wanted to tell him not to, wanted to keep him by the fire, but the words lodged in her throat. Instead, she managed a whisper. "Be careful." He gave a small nod and stepped into the storm, the door closing behind him with a sigh. Evelyn sat frozen, listening to the howl of wind and the distant answering cries of wolves. Minutes passed. The kettle hissed again. The children slept on, their faces soft with trust. Finally, the door creaked open. He returned, shoulders dusted with snow, a faint smear of blood across his arm. "Gone," he said simply. She rose, finding herself close enough to smell the cold on him, the wild scent of pine and smoke. Without thinking, she took his arm to see the wound, a shallow cut. Her fingers trembled as she dabbed it with a cloth. He watched her with quiet curiosity, as though surprised by her concern. "You shouldn't go out alone," she murmured. He smiled faintly, a rare, soft curve of his lips. "Now not alone." The words settled between them like warmth. Evelyn felt something shift inside her, an ache loosening, a door opening. When he lay back by the fire with his children, she sat awake long after, watching the snow blur the world beyond her window. The storm deepened, sealing them in. By dawn, the drifts would be too high for anyone to leave. And as she stared into the white horizon, she realized that for the first time in years, she was no longer afraid of being found. She was afraid of what it would mean if they left. Morning came slow, like the world was remembering how to breathe again. Light seeped through the frost-laced window, pale and uncertain, spilling across the wooden floor where 3 small bodies slept bundled in blankets. Evelyn stood at the stove, stirring a pot of oats that hissed and thickened, the smell of warmth and cinnamon drifting through the cabin. Behind her, she heard soft footsteps, the patter of bare feet, a quiet giggle. When she turned, the smallest child, Taya, stood watching her, thumb in mouth, golden firelight painting her cheeks. Evelyn smiled, though her heart ached with something she didn't yet have a name for. Outside, an axe split the silence. She looked through the window and saw him. Tayan, bare-armed in the snow, swinging with a steady rhythm. Each blow sent a sharp crack echoing through the cold. Steam rose from his skin, and his breath hung like smoke. He moved with the certainty of a man used to labor, yet there was grace in it, too, something measured, almost peaceful. She hadn't asked him to cut wood, but he did. Maybe he needed to. Maybe he understood the language of work better than words. The children crowded around the table when she called. Their small hands fumbled with the spoons, faces lighting with surprise at the sweetness of honey she drizzled into their bowls. Soma, the eldest, nodded once before eating, solemn, polite beyond his years. Nail laughed at the way Taya smeared honey across her chin. Evelyn felt herself soften, drawn to the sound. It had been years since laughter had filled this room. When the door opened, Tayan stepped in, a gust of cold following him. Snow melted down his arms, tracing lines along his muscles. Evelyn looked away too quickly, stirring the pot again though it was empty. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured. He wiped his hands on a rag. "Cold better when work." His voice was rough, uncertain, but his eyes carried calm. She nodded, unsure how to answer. Their silence stretched, not heavy but new, like a room adjusting to shared air. Later, while he repaired the broken latch on the barn door, Evelyn stood by the porch with a blanket around her shoulders. The world was white and endless, each pine branch bowed under snow. The triplets played near the fence, building crooked mounds and calling them homes. "Mama's house," Nail said proudly, pointing at his pile. Evelyn's breath caught. She glanced toward Tayan, but his back was turned. His shoulders stilled for a moment, though, as if he'd heard. She wanted to ask about their mother, about what had happened, but the question felt too sharp to touch. Instead, she carried water from the well, feeling his quiet gaze follow her. By evening, the cabin was filled with the scent of stew and wood smoke. The children had fallen asleep before their bowls were empty, their small bodies draped against the floor rug. Evelyn tucked them under blankets, brushing snowflakes from their hair. Tayan sat near the fire, sharpening his knife with long, slow strokes. The scrape of metal on stone blended with the crackle of burning logs. "You can stay another night," she said without turning. He paused, looking up. "Storm not done." "No," she agreed. "Not yet." Something about the words made her chest tighten. She sat across from him, the flames flickering between them. The heat blurred the air, softening the lines of his face. He reached for the kettle, poured her a cup without asking, then handed it across the fire. His fingers brushed hers, just barely, but the touch lingered like an echo. "Children safe now," he said, eyes lowered. "They are," she whispered. "They're good children. Strong." He smiled faintly, almost proud. "Like their mother." The quiet deepened. Evelyn wanted to ask more, to know her name, the color of her hair, the shape of her laughter, but she only said, "I'm sorry." He looked up. "For what?" "For the world being cruel." He said nothing for a while, only stared into the fire. "She gone when snow came last year." His voice was simple, stripped bare of grief, as if saying the words again might keep them from cutting too deep. Evelyn nodded, the ache in her chest sharp and strange. Loss was a language she understood well. "I buried someone in the snow once too," she said softly. "Not from death, just from shame." Tayan tilted his head, eyes narrowing in quiet curiosity. She offered no more, and he did not ask. Still, she felt seen in a way that frightened her. Outside, a sleigh bell rang faintly, the sound of someone passing along the distant trail. Evelyn stiffened. If anyone saw smoke rising from her chimney, they'd wonder. If anyone saw him, they'd judge. The town had never forgiven her before, it would not forgive her now. She rose, crossing to the window, her breath fogging the glass. "There's a neighbor who brings flowers sometimes," she murmured. "If she comes, it's best you stay out of sight." Tayan nodded once, no anger, no shame, just understanding. "People talk," he said quietly. "Yes," she replied, eyes on the snow. "They always do." The next morning, she found him outside at dawn, mending the broken fence. The children trailed behind, carrying small sticks like helpers. The sight made her smile despite the ache in her stomach. When the neighbor's sleigh appeared down the road, Tayan moved wordlessly into the trees. Evelyn greeted the woman with forced cheer. The woman's gaze swept over the cabin, lingering on the children's toys by the porch. Her eyes narrowed, suspicion blooming like frost. "Seems you've company," she said. Evelyn forced a smile. "Just passing travelers." "Travelers?" The woman's tone dripped with disbelief. "In a storm like this? You be careful who you open your door to, Evelyn Hayes. Folks still remember." The words cut like a blade. Evelyn closed the door after she left and pressed her palms against the wood, trembling. When Tayan returned, she couldn't meet his eyes. "They'll start talking again," she whispered. He set the tools down gently. "You give bread. You give fire. That is good. They won't see it that way." He studied her for a long moment, then reached into his cloak and pulled out a small carving, a bird, wings outstretched. He placed it on the table. "For you," he said simply. Her throat tightened. The carving was rough but beautiful, the shape alive in her palm. "Why?" He looked toward the children, then back at her. "Because you opened door." The simplicity undid her. Tears she hadn't felt in years threatened to rise. She turned toward the window, swallowing hard. Snow drifted in slow, silent flakes, as if time itself had softened. That night as the children slept, Tayan repaired the last of her broken chairs. Evelyn sat by the fire, the little carving resting beside her. She realized the cabin no longer felt like a cage, but like a place breathing again. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was shared. When he rose to bank the fire, their eyes met in the dim light. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to say something real. Instead, she only whispered, "Good night." He nodded once. "Tomorrow I fix roof." Her lips curved. "You plan to stay that long?" He paused, then smiled. A quiet, unguarded smile that reached his eyes. "Storm not done," he said. She watched him disappear into the shadows, heart thudding like distant thunder. The snow outside thickened, cloaking the world again. And for the first time since her ruin, Evelyn prayed the storm would never end. The snow thinned in early March, retreating from the edges of the world like a tide pulling back from shore. Meltwater whispered through the gullies, and the air held the faintest scent of earth again. Mud, thawing pine smoke. Evelyn stood by the doorway that morning, shawl drawn tight, watching Tayan lift the last of the split logs to stack against the wall. His breath steamed in the pale sunlight, his shoulders glistening with the effort. Behind him, the triplets played near the barn, their laughter carrying across the clearing like a sound the world had forgotten it could make. For a moment, she let herself imagine this was home, that the ache inside her had finally quieted. But then she remembered the world beyond the trees. And she remembered how the world spoke. "We're out of flour," she murmured, almost to herself. Tayan turned, nodding once. "I go?" he asked. She shook her head quickly. "No, they wouldn't serve you." Her words came softer than she meant, edged with the old fear. "I'll go." The look he gave her was neither protest nor permission, only understanding, quiet and watchful. He set the axe down, his dark eyes lingering a little longer than before, as though memorizing her before she walked back into the noise that had once broken her. The road to town was a narrow brown wound through the snow. The thaw made it slick and cruel, and by the time Evelyn reached the first cluster of fences, her skirts were heavy with mud. The church bell tolled from somewhere beyond the ridge, a hollow sound swallowed by wind. Her heart beat faster with every step. The general store sat at the center of town, squat and weathered, the same as she remembered it. Inside, it smelled of tobacco and flour dust, of iron nails and horse grease. She pulled her hood low and entered. For a moment, no one looked. Then a whisper rose from the far counter like a spark catching dry straw. "That her? She's back. She's got an Apache living up there, you know." Evelyn's hands tightened around the basket. The old woman behind the counter smiled without warmth. "Been some time, Miss Hayes. Still up in that cabin?" Evelyn nodded, her voice steady only because she forced it to be. "Just needed flour and coffee." The woman turned, scooping the flour, her movements deliberate. You alone up there? Evelyn hesitated. No, she said finally. There are children. The woman's spoon stopped mid-scoop. Children, she repeated, the word already turning poisonous in her mouth. Before Evelyn could answer, the door opened and two men entered, their boots loud on the wooden floor. They smelled of whiskey and curiosity. One of them tipped his hat mockingly. Heard tell you're keeping company, Miss Hayes, he said. Big fella, dark-skinned, quiet sort. You got yourself a new man, or are you running a boarding house? The laughter that followed was low and sharp, the kind meant to wound. Evelyn's cheeks burned. She wanted to flee, but she lifted her chin instead. He and his children were starving. I helped them. That's all. Helped, one man echoed, his grin spreading. That what they're calling it now? The storekeeper's hand stilled on the counter. Even those who'd once pitied her now looked through her, as though shame were contagious. Evelyn paid and left without another word. Outside, the wind had turned bitter again. Her fingers ached as she clutched the basket, each step away from town feeling heavier than the one before. Behind her, laughter followed, faint but unmistakable. The sound didn't fade, it burrowed. By the time she reached the forest trail, her eyes were wet, though the tears froze before they could fall. When she stepped into the clearing, Tayan was waiting near the well, wiping his hands on his trousers. He saw her face and said nothing, but the stillness in him changed, sharpened. She set the basket down too hard, the flour spilling across the snow. They know, she said hoarsely. They saw me. They know you're here. He looked toward the trees, then back to her. Bad? She nodded, unable to meet his eyes. They think her voice broke. They think the worst. Again. He stood quiet for a long moment, then knelt to gather the spilled flour with his bare hands, brushing it into the sack. His calmness made her anger rise, not at him, but at the years that had taught her to be small. Don't you understand? She snapped. They'll come. They'll make this their business. He met her gaze then, and something fierce moved behind his calm. You give them no hurt, he said. You give them kindness. They only talk. His steadiness undid her. It's not just talk, she whispered. Last time it ruined me. He straightened, the faintest trace of sorrow in his eyes. Then we stay quiet, he said softly. And strong. The next day the storm returned. Not snow this time, but wind and rumor. Two riders came at dusk, their silhouettes cutting through the pale sky. Evelyn saw them before Tayan did. She set the children inside and stepped out to meet them, her hands hidden in her apron to keep them from shaking. The men dismounted slowly. One was the same who'd mocked her at the store. The other she recognized as the deputy. Evenin', Miss Hayes, the deputy said. Heard you've got some company up here. Folks say there's a savage living under your roof. There's a man here, Evelyn said evenly. He's done nothing wrong. The other man spat into the snow. Wrong's what you call it, maybe. But half the town thinks you're up here breaking God's law. Her stomach twisted. He's got children. They needed warmth. That's all. Then where is he? The deputy asked. The door creaked open. Tayan stepped out slowly, his size filling the frame, his expression unreadable. He said nothing, only met their eyes with the stillness of a storm before it breaks. The men's hands hovered near their belts. Evelyn stepped forward. If you came to frighten him, you can leave. This is my home. The deputy hesitated, uncertain, then shifted his stance. You're alone out here, Miss Hayes. Wouldn't want to see you mixed up in something that ends bad. Tayan took one step forward, not menacing, but enough that both men's horses snorted and backed away. We leave when snow goes, he said quietly. No trouble. The deputy studied him for a long moment, then nodded. See that you do. When they rode off, Evelyn felt her knees weaken. The silence afterward was thick and trembling. She turned toward Tayan, her voice breaking. You didn't have to stand between us. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. I stand where danger is. Something inside her cracked. For years she had faced cruelty alone, her name dragged through dirt, her kindness mistaken for weakness. But now, for the first time, someone had stood in front of her without asking anything in return. That night, after the children fell asleep, she sat by the fire staring into its heart. The room glowed with the gold of peace and the red of fear. Tayan sat near the doorway, mending his cloak. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to tell him that his quiet had steadied her in ways no words could, but she only said, "They won't stop talking." He didn't look up. "Let them. Snow always covers prints." The words hung between them, simple and mysterious. Evelyn turned to the window. The wind had softened, but in its place came another sound, the low, distant cry of wolves. Her pulse quickened. She rose, peering into the dark. "They're close again." Tayan set down his cloak. "Tomorrow I make trap." Evelyn nodded, though her throat felt tight. The reflection of the fire flickered in the glass, showing her face beside his. Two exiles framed by flame and snow. Outside, a shadow moved along the treeline, silent and patient. Inside, the air thickened with something neither danger nor desire but both. And as the night deepened, Evelyn realized the greatest threat was no longer the town beyond the forest. It was how much she was beginning to need the man they feared. The night cracked open with the sound of the wind. It howled across the valley, dragging the scent of cold earth and pine through every crack in the cabin walls. Evelyn woke to the sound of the door banging once, twice, then flying open. The fire had burned low. For a heartbeat she thought it was the storm come to claim them, until she saw Tayan's silhouette in the threshold, his body tense, his breath wild. "Wolves," he said, voice barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of alarm. Evelyn rushed to the children, pulling them close, her hands trembling as she felt their warmth against her chest. Outside, the world was alive with movement, shadows streaking across the snow, the low, guttural snarls of hunger. Tayan grabbed the axe by the door and stepped into the storm. His figure vanished into the white almost instantly. "Don't, please," she called after him, but the wind devoured her words. The fire flickered weakly, its light crawling across the walls. Evelyn threw wood into the stove, sparks flaring like frightened birds. She could hear the wolves now, circling, taunting, closer. A cry broke through the storm, half man, half beast. She clutched the rifle hanging by the door, though her hands could barely steady it. The children whimpered, their eyes wide with terror. "Stay here," she whispered, though she didn't know if she meant it for them or for herself. She stepped outside. The cold hit her like a blade. Snow swirled in mad spirals, the moon only a faint smear behind clouds. At the edge of the clearing, Tayan stood, half buried in snow, his axe red in the dim light. 3 wolves lay motionless nearby, their shapes melting into the drifts, but a fourth still circled, low and deliberate. "Go inside," he shouted, voice rough, carried on the storm. But she couldn't. Something stronger than fear anchored her there. The beast lunged. It collided with him, and they fell into the snow together, rolling, a blur of fur, muscle and fury. Evelyn raised the rifle, heart hammering so loud it drowned everything else. She waited for a clear shot, but the 2 bodies were too close, too fast. Then Tayan's cry split the air, raw and human. Without thinking, she fired. The report shattered the night. Silence followed, so sudden it hurt her ears. The wolf lay still. Evelyn dropped the rifle and ran to him, stumbling through the drifts. Blood streaked his arm, bright against the snow. His breath came ragged, but his eyes were steady as he looked up at her. "Good shot," he said softly. Her hands were on him before she could think, pressing, trembling, searching for the wound. "You're bleeding, God, you're bleeding." He smiled faintly, that same calm that infuriated and steadied her in equal measure. "Little blood. Not die tonight." But she could see how pale he was, how the cold had sunk deep into him. "You're coming inside," she said, and before he could protest, she took his arm and helped him rise. He was heavy, impossibly heavy, and yet she didn't stop until they crossed the threshold, until she had him by the fire, where the children stared in wide, silent awe. She tore a strip from her dress and pressed it against the wound, her fingers slick with blood. He didn't flinch, only watched her face as if memorizing it. "You shake," he murmured. "I'm not cold," she said, but her voice cracked. The firelight danced across his skin, turning the sweat and blood to bronze and gold. When she looked into his eyes, she saw not the stranger she had let in weeks ago, but the anchor her soul had been drifting toward. "You shouldn't have gone out there alone," she whispered. He tilted his head slightly, a small smile ghosting across his lips. "You come after me anyway." She wanted to argue, to tell him she hadn't known why she did, but she knew. Somewhere between fear and defiance, something had taken root, something deep as the thawing earth. When his breathing eased, she leaned back, exhausted. The children were asleep again, curled near the stove. The storm raged outside, relentless, but the cabin felt untouched, held together by something invisible and sacred. Tayan's voice broke the silence. "When spring comes," he said slowly, "we leave. Go south. Build home near river." Evelyn turned toward him. "You'll leave?" He looked at her, and the quiet between them felt sharp. "If we stay, people bring trouble to you." Her throat tightened. She thought of the town, the laughter, the whispers, the way they had always taken her peace and twisted it into shame. And then she thought of this moment, the warmth, the safety, the sound of his breathing mingling with hers. "Maybe I don't care what they think anymore," she said softly. He studied her for a long time, then reached out, his fingers brushing her wrist. "Care makes heart heavy," he said. "But love," he paused, searching for the word. "Love makes it brave." Her eyes burned. She wanted to look away, but couldn't. His hand slipped into hers, rough and warm. In that touch lived everything they couldn't say. The shared silence, the sleepless nights, the way loneliness had softened into belonging. Outside, the storm began to break. Wind fell away into the whisper of snow against the roof. Dawn crept across the horizon, slow and golden, lighting the frost on the window like shattered glass. Hours passed before Tayan could stand again. Evelyn helped him to the door, the two of them framed by the pale morning. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin and steady. The world glittered under a clean white sun. The triplets followed, blinking in the light. They ran into the yard, their laughter scattering into the cold air. Tayan watched them, his arm heavy around Evelyn's shoulders. "You saved us," he said quietly. She shook her head. "No. You saved me long before tonight." He looked down at her then, his gaze filled with something gentle and unguarded. For a moment, she thought he might speak, but instead he pressed his forehead to hers. Silent, reverent, eternal. The gesture said more than words ever could. Later, when he went to mend the fence, she stood at the doorway watching. The snow was melting fast, small rivers of silver cutting through the drifts. The air smelled of pine sap and earth, the promise of spring. She realized she wasn't waiting for the world to forgive her anymore. She was already forgiven. That night, as the sun fell and the fire burned high again, she took the carving he'd made, the small bird with open wings, and placed it above the hearth. The symbol of flight, of freedom, of something fragile learning to trust the wind. She looked at him, sitting by the fire with his children asleep against him, the light gilding his face. He met her eyes, and the room filled with a quiet that felt holy. Outside, snow still drifted lazily through the dark, but the fire beneath it burned steady, alive, unwavering. And as she watched the flames, Evelyn understood. Sometimes love doesn't roar or declare itself. It endures. It warms without asking permission. When spring finally came, no one in town dared to climb the mountain. But from far away, if one looked closely, they could see a thin trail of smoke curling above the trees. Proof that two souls, once judged and broken, had built a home the world could no longer touch.